Well, here we are adrift on the Pawcatuck River. This is going to be the fall version of my seasonal tree ID hikes, or in this case, a tree ID adventure. And yes, we are in a canoe here. It's the third week of October, and the colors are pretty much at their peak along the Pawcatuck River. This is in Washington County, Rhode Island, just east of the Connecticut border. And this river does make the border between those two states the last few miles of its course to the sea. So this adventure today is going to be about a 6-mile paddle from the Bradford Dam, which is no longer there, but there's a fish ladder type dam you can take the canoe through with some pretty good waves. And then we're going to take out just above the Potter Hill Dam, which is unrunnable. It's a deadly dam that you definitely want to take out above. So along the river here, we're going to be recording some of the common trees along the floodplain of this river, which are not always the trees you find on other floodplains. This is a pretty unique habitat here. This is all sand plain along here, so you get some acid-loving plants that like that sandy soil of southern Rhode Island here. And there's a preserve called the Riverwood Preserve that adjoins the Pawcatuck River. The trail system of the Riverwood Preserve goes right down to the banks of the river, but then abruptly goes up on some steep rocky ledges where I could find a larger variety of trees than those found immediately along the river. So we'll be looking for nut trees today, especially oaks, hickories, as well as some of the common maples in this area. The highly acid soils around here make it tough on a sugar maple. We might see a few, but I'm expecting mostly to find red maple and maybe a few silver maples hanging out along this stream. So the Pawcatuck River, we've got a perfect fall day to start this adventure. We'll see how many species of trees we can find on a 6-mile canoe trip and probably about a 2 or 3 mile hike on the bluffs and cliffs of the Riverwood Preserve itself. And overhanging the banks of the Pawcatuck River here is one of several species of oak I expect to find today. And this particular tree is called the swamp white oak, and has leaves that could resemble some other oaks, including the chestnut oak and the chinkapin oak. I came just a few feet downstream from that larger swamp white oak that was overhanging the banks here. Got one with a branch that's low enough we can record the leaves at least. I'm not seeing any acorns on this branch here for us to study, but because it's a white oak, or in the white oak group, it does get acorns every year. Some of the oaks we're going to study today do not, so we're going to have to flip a coin to see if there are acorns available for us to study on the oaks that are in the red oak group, which includes pin oak, black oak, bare oak, scarlet oak, and a few others. So I'm expecting to get at least 5 or 6 species of oak today, including 2 along the Pawcatuck River itself. I've already seen pin oak. I'm going to record that in a few minutes. But the wavy edge of this swamp white oak doesn't have as many lobes or waves as the chestnut oak or the chinkapin oak. And the back of these leaves is a much lighter color than the front, and much lighter in comparison than those of the chinkapin oak or the chestnut oak, neither of which I would expect to find along this floodplain, especially the chestnut oak. It's pretty much restricted to high and dry soils. Chinkapin oak could sneak its way down towards a stream if it grew in this area, but it doesn't. So swamp white oak, it has a bark it's deeply furrowed, and a little more furrowed than most standard regular white oak trees. And also doesn't get that flaking at the top of the branches that the regular white oak trees do. We'll see those today as well. That'll be one of the species of oak I would expect to find today. But these swamp white oaks normally grow in areas that have wet soil, swamps, or riversides. I recorded it on a similar seasonal tree ID hike earlier this year along the Scantic River in January. So it is to be found along the rivers in southern New England here, but not every river. I don't see it everywhere I go. Well, it sure is a pretty morning here to study these trees. Let's see if the blue skies last all day. It may get some fair weather puffy clouds today that could steal away from the perfect blue skies. But let's study another one of the several oaks we're going to find along these adventure today. I've already recorded the swamp white oak about a mile back. I was looking for a pin oak, which is very common along this floodplain, that I could get a good look at the leaves and the acorns. We've got them both right here. And these acorns are about a ½ inch across. So smaller than most acorns on other oaks in this area, with the exception of the bare oak. And there is bare oak in the Riverwood Preserve. And I believe when I was there in August, I did see some acorns on those trees. So we'll look at those if we can today. Meanwhile, the leaves of this pin oak are handsomely dissected. And they sure could be confused with the scarlet oak, except they tend to be a little smaller in size. They're about 4 to 5 inches long here. And here's a close-up look at our acorns. Boy, this is a good year for acorns. Those are about a ½ inch across. They actually have some stripes on them, at least these ones do. There's my fingernail for scale, so you can see how small those are. About the size of my fingernail itself. With a nice, neatly knit acorn cap that is not coming loose at all. So yes, these leaves are about 4 to 5 inches long. My finger's kind of in there for scale. I got the camera in one hand and I'm holding on to keep the current from pushing me past this tree with the other hand. So these can resemble that of a scarlet oak, with that looks like almost the flames of a campfire. Pin oaks tend to grow in riverside locations and swamps, and usually not on the uplands where we commonly find the scarlet oak, but they can grow near each other. I did Barking Up the Right Oak in January of 2022, and I found both of them real near each other in a park with a swamp forest right next to an upland forest. So I actually compared the two side by side at that point. So that is still on this channel. Let's start drifting along. We'll take a look at some maples and some other trees along the river here. We got about 3 miles to float till we get to Riverwood Preserve. And we'll trade the paddling shoes for the hiking shoes for a couple hours. And we just stirred up one of several flocks of wood ducks along this river. So it's very secluded. Hardly any houses along here. And the pin oak is still green this time of year. Doesn't get good fall color like its scarlet oak cousin that has very similar foliage. Usually they just turn brown, unfortunately, but they're nice landscape trees for other reasons. And the golds and oranges and magentas, every shade of red and yellow and orange you can imagine can be found on these red maples that are very common along the banks of the Pawcatuck River here. Pin oak on the left, red maple on the right. That's probably about 50% of the trees right here. But there are some more upland trees that kind of sneak down onto the floodplain here. And hey, they don't read the book. They will grow in the floodplain as long as it doesn't flood so much that it drowns them out. So because this is so sandy around here, some of these upland trees will grow on the floodplain because it drains quickly and doesn't usually flood that many days of the year. So we'll take a better look at red maple when we get out of the boat. But it's definitely one of the most common trees along this floodplain, but it's also common on the uplands around here as well. I've done a lot of work with red maple this year, and I just put up part 3 of a 3-part series on red maple, where we took a closer look at the foliage and all the places it can grow. As we're drifting along here, we're getting right underneath a gray birch. So these have an arrowhead shaped leaf. You don't find it in the closed canopy woods around here that have been woods for a while, but you do find it along roadsides. Areas that have burned more recently where the canopy is open again. And along these riversides. It's pretty common along this Pawcatuck River, but it only grows where it can get sun, so it has to lean sideways to do that. And yes, more red maple behind it. One other tree that's very beautiful in the fall that may have lost most of its leaves on this particular stretch of river, and that's the black gum. Black gum doesn't always turn early, but it tends to turn early along this stretch of river. Some more red maple right there. And I do have a black gum in the field of view here. None of the leaves are close enough to the water for us to really see up close, but there's a few of them around here that haven't lost all their leaves. But beautiful tree and very common along this river, and commonly turns colors several weeks earlier than the rest of the trees. A maple tree that's common along riverbanks but not in this area is our silver maple. The Pawcatuck River, I've paddled it 3 or 4 times in the last couple years, and I don't see a lot of silver maple, but there are a few along here. This one has actually fallen into the river and is sending sprouts basically going vertical. So the tree fell sideways, but it didn't die. The roots are still intact. There's a whole bunch of trees in a clump right there, and one of them fell into the river, and now up it goes. So you can clearly see the leaf here. And it has some of the features of a sugar maple and some of the features of a red maple. Jagged, rough, torn edge like that of a red maple. Some deeper, rounded notches like that of a sugar maple, so it's like a compromise between the two. And is commonly found along major streams in this country, especially west of here, and occasionally along this Pawcatuck River. So one reason it's called silver maple is the back of that leaf, which you can see right there, is more of a silvery white color, and the front is a medium green color. So the contrast between the two is more extreme than that of the red maple or the sugar maple. And a few of these black gums still have some nice color for us to observe. This one here is low-hanging branches right over the river here. And most of the leaves on these black gums are not that big, but they can get big in certain locations. It's not always a river bottom or bottomland tree. Around here it tends to grow along the rivers or along streams where the soil is moist or in wetlands. Did some more work with black gum last year, a winter and summer appearance, 2 separate videos. We do have some fruits here that are edible, but not always that palatable. I've tried them before. They taste okay. You could eat them if you had to. There's plenty left on this tree. The birds haven't gotten to all of them. So if you catch them at the right time of the year, they're very plentiful. But these branches are just covered in these beautiful kind of oblong leaves that come to a point. 2 to 3 inches long, but they can get a lot larger on some trees, especially trees that are getting lots of sun. There's a branch right behind me here. This little branch right here has got leaves a lot larger. I have found black gum on ridgetop locations, not around here, but down in Kentucky, where the leaves are quite a bit larger. And I almost thought it was a different tree. So very shiny leaf, handsome color, The form of this tree is quite unique. I can't really get a good study of that from this vantage, but the branches tend to come straight out from the main trunk. They don't droop down or up, but they tend to come out at 90 degrees. You can see that on some of these smaller branches right here. But the whole tree can have that same kind of form. We'll keep paddling along. We're only about a mile from Riverwood Preserve, and we'll get out and stretch the legs and get on the hiking shoes and get up on the rock bluffs there that have lots of nut trees that I've found over the last few months, and I thought I'd come back and record them as well as enjoy this beautiful paddling trip here. And as we drift along here, our floodplain, boy, instead of having closed canopy, thick forest, it's quite open right here. There's a lot of oxbows in the river here. We're getting near Riverwood Preserve here, and full sun opportunity for a floodplain tree that loves full sun, and that's our black willow right here. That's the only willow in this area that actually gets to be tree size. None of these are that big, but they're big enough to call a tree and not a shrub. They're 25, 30 feet high. More information about black willow and sandbar willow from 3 years ago on this channel. I did it in Indiana. I was living in the Ohio Valley at the time. They're pretty common along some of those rivers, but definitely more common where the river shifts courses enough that there's always sandbars and open areas for it to colonize. Just like cottonwoods, the willows make a seed that drifts around in the wind and will land just about anywhere, and if there's enough sun and open soil, it will start growing. Let's drift a little closer to this guy right up here and take a look at those leaves. And we've gotten underneath this black willow tree. Between the current and the wind, I got to hang on with one hand and record with the other. Boy, the sun can make it challenging some days when it's this low in the sky, but it also makes for great lighting. So I think we can clearly see the geometry of these leaves. Some of them are 4 or 5 inches long. They're a nice handsome green in the summer. Now they're turning more of a yellow color on this tree. And the day I did the recording for this tree was midsummer, and we found sandbar willow on the sandbars along the White River as well. That's more of a shrub. Can get 15 or 20 feet high, but usually it doesn't. The teeth along this black willow leaf, or along the margin of this leaf. Okay, well, willow branches break off easy, so that one snapped off while I was trying to record it. But the teeth along the edge of this black willow leaf are very small, about the size of that on a hacksaw. And those of a sandbar willow, which I don't see along this river, are quite a bit larger, and they stick out a lot further. So they're easy to tell apart. Black willow tends to be the same color on both sides. In this case, it's turned a little bit more of a yellow color because of the time of year. And the sandbar willow, it's a lot like our silver maple. It's a lot lighter on one side than the other. So we'll keep drifting along. We'll be to our exit to the Riverwood Preserve in just about a half a mile here. Well, after about 2 hours of paddling time and 3 hours on the river, we're going to stop at Riverwood Preserve. Several loops here. There's orange, there's red, there's blue. Lots of ledge back here where we can look at parts of the tree that aren't always visible as you're hiking in more open forest, like right here where it's open at the bottom and closed canopy at the top. So let's start walking. I already see a few nuts that we can study, and we'll keep looking for nut trees and whatever else makes sense to record today. One of the more common trees in these acid soils of southern New England, rock ledges and sand plains. It's a tree with a acorn cap that's quite unique. This is one of the few acorn caps that actually shines when you pick it up and touch it. It's got a luster to it, like it's been sprayed with a gloss clear coat or polyurethane. That's our scarlet oak. Shape of the acorn and the cap are similar to other oaks. We'll put a couple of these in my pocket, see if we can find some black oak, some white oak, maybe some red oak to compare it with. So where the acorns are, there's usually a parent tree right nearby. I believe this is it right here. Going straight up. So scarlet oaks tend to grow pretty straight. They often have a pattern at the bottom of the tree with little polygons, and then it gets smoother and almost resembles that of a pin oak or a northern red oak as you go up. Boy, and the gold color of the hickories has really come alive this week. People don't always think a hickory is a real pretty tree in the fall, but they can be brilliant. Usually it is a gold color. I'm pretty sure what I have here is a mocker nut hickory. I found some nut fragments on the ground. The barks on the hickories when they're young can be very similar. I've got a larger example over here where the bark is interwoven but not flaky or shaggy or even starting to shag up. I'm pretty sure this is a mocker nut hickory. We've got more than 5 leaflets on most of the leaves, which narrows it down to either mocker nut or bitter nut. And the other 2 hickories that are common around here, the pig nut and the shagbark, have usually 5 leaflets and not more than that. But this bark holds together well. There's nothing breaking free at all, even a little bit, and that usually means mocker nut or bitter nut. Got some big nut fragments here, about the size of a golf ball. So the bitter nut and the pig nut have small nuts. They're about an inch, maybe an inch and a half at the most. This thing's about 2, and they can get even larger. So this would narrow it down to either a mocker nut shell or a shagbark shell for this area. And the way you can tell them apart if the nut isn't there is the shell. They're about the same size, but the husk or the outer shell on this mocker nut tree is much thinner than that of the shagbark. We'll put it in my pocket. We'll see if we can find a shagbark to compare it with as we hike today. Well, plenty of ledges and shallow soils at this Riverwood preserve. Probably never made very good farmland, but some very scenic hiking right next to the Pawcatuck River. And I think we got a northern red oak growing in a clump right here. And the bark tends to not be chunky or in polygons like at the base of the tree like you would find on the scarlet oak, which is also quite common on this trail. I got both acorns. The scarlet oak I found a few minutes ago, and the northern red oak acorn I found right here underneath the tree. There's so many varieties of oak here on this trail, you could easily find 3 or 4 kinds of acorns in one area. So you have to know which tree creates which acorn. But our scarlet oak acorn that we found right next to the river there has that real shiny cap, and it's the bottom of the acorn, or the nut itself, is shaped like a Hershey's Kiss. And our northern red oak acorn is got a real shallow cap on the top. Almost looks like a beret that people in France would wear on top of the head. And it's very similar in geometry to that of the pin oak, but quite a bit larger. That pin oak was only as big as my index finger fingernail, and this is probably 3 times as large, so much larger. And the leaves are quite different too. Leaves are not always easy to get to unless they fall on the ground, but we're going to study them on some of these ledges if we can get some lower hanging branches. But we'll at least be looking at bark and nuts today, and leaves when we can. Well, extensive ledge systems cover the trails here at Riverwood Preserve, where there's a lot of stunted trees that may not be as young as they look because of the stressful environment here. Some of these trees may be older than they look because it's very thin soil. And yes, there was granite quarrying around here. Westerly, Rhode Island is known for its granite quarries. I've talked to people that live near here. They said the quarries here were opened up. They tried to mine it, and it just didn't break into clean sheets. It curved too much when they tried to break it, so they abandoned the quarries pretty quickly. But you can see the spoils here of stones that didn't make the cut. And we looked at that scarlet oak acorn a few minutes ago, and here's some scarlet oak starting to get that scarlet color. Come back in a few days, it'd probably be even more robust in its red and magenta colors, even purple. And these leaves do resemble that of the pin oak. I wouldn't expect to find a pin oak growing up on this ledge. They can get quite a bit larger, but these are honestly about the same size as the pin oak we saw earlier today. About as big as my hand, about as big as the size of my hand. So habitat tells the difference between the scarlet oak and the pin oak normally. The bark on these scarlet oaks, especially where it's prone to brush fires, like up on this ledge here, is really thick and corky at the bottom and gets a little more smooth as we go up the tree. And the nut that goes with this tree is the one we found earlier with this Hershey's Kiss shaped nut inside a acorn cap that looks like it's been sprayed with a high gloss shellac. Well, there's many species of oak on these ledges. We'll see what else we can record right here. A little bit of black birch hanging out along this ledge as well. White oak can get to be really big and grow in really good soil, but around here you can find it growing on these ledge systems as well. And it almost looks like a post oak, but I don't think it is. It's not showing any of the other signs of a post oak, but this is all a scrub form of white oak here. We saw that swamp white oak earlier. We'll take a look at some other white oak scrub form right down the trail here. Before we do that, let's look at a bare oak. So bare oak is a shrub type tree. It can get 15-20 feet high, but it often doesn't. It often grows in these areas with full sun, either in sandy areas or on these ledges. And in eastern and southeastern New England, it's actually quite common because of the fact there's a lot of sand and a lot of ledge around here. And the leaves on these bare oaks are quite small. When I did the spring version of this seasonal tree ID hike at Sleeping Giant State Park back in April, the bare oaks there were in bloom. There was catkins on them. It takes a couple years at least, sometimes more than that, for these bare oak catkins to become acorns. And most of the acorns have fallen off this tree, but the cap is still on the branch. So that's not even as big. The cap itself is not even as big as my thumbnail. They're about the size of those acorns we found on the pin oak this morning. But the leaves are small, maybe 2 or 3 inches long, much smaller than most of the other oaks, and have fewer lobes than most other oaks. Here's another bare oak growing right between these slabs of granite that didn't make the cut here. So it just tends to grow where there's full sun. It can withstand brush fires because the roots go down in the cracks in the rock, and will survive even if the top of the tree burns. So it's more like a shrub tree in this area. I've been to parks where it gets quite tall, 15-20 feet. I was up on Wantoskakit Mountain a year and a half ago and found it growing quite tall there, as well as Boston's Blue Hills Reservation. I found some examples there that were 15-20 feet high. But it's often small and in a shrub form. It never really becomes tree sized. And that scrub form of the white oak that I talked about a few minutes ago, we got one here that's got some nice colors on it. We still have that ash gray color of a white oak. Some beautiful fall colors. So the lobes on that swamp white oak we saw a few hours ago were shallow and lots of lobes that went around the edges of it, but the notches between the lobes were shallow, and here you can see they're much deeper. So it's definitely different. The bark is different in texture. The acorns are quite different, but we haven't found acorns of either of these trees today to study. So we'll be looking at bark and leaves. And I wouldn't expect to find a swamp white oak growing up on this bare rock ledge. So there's several more ledges in this park. We'll do as many as we have time for today, but we do need to allow time to get back to the canoe, paddle down to Potter Hill Dam, and then shuttle back to my vehicle to finish today's adventure. And plenty more oaks along this Blue Blaze Trail we're taking right now. Got a better look at a white oak right here. Get a little closer to the leaves and the bark. That ash gray bark, it tends to flake off on the upper branches, at least away from the trunk. So it flakes off sideways like that. And here's your traditional shape of a white oak leaf, which again, these notches are, everything is rounded on it, but unlike the swamp white oak, these lobes come out a lot further and the notches are a lot deeper between the lobes. And I did find a few white oak acorns on the ground right underneath it. Put those in the center of the screen here. So this right here is my thumbnail for scale. Is a white oak acorn. The knitting on the top is if you think of it as knitting, they used a thicker, coarser yarn to knit the cap on this acorn than they did on this red oak acorn. And they even used an even coarser knit yarn to knit the highly shiny cap of this scarlet oak acorn. So I got all three right here. White oak, northern red oak, and at the bottom of your screen is the scarlet oak. So again, scarlet oak on the bottom of the screen, white oak on the right side, and northern red oak on the left side, upper left. And the red maple that was common along the Pawcatuck River is scattered throughout Riverwood Preserve, but it's not that common back here. It's here in places. But let's just take a look at red maple leaves. We looked at the silver maple leaf. There's some red maple leaves here. There's one here that looks about average. So usually 5 lobes with a rough torn edge and V-shaped notches between the lobes. I believe you can see that right there. I think you can clearly see that V-shaped notch between those lobes now. And yes, it's starting to get that red color. And another tree that gets consistently good fall color, usually oranges and reds, is our sassafras. It's scattered throughout this park. Most of these woods, I think, have been here long enough for the sassafras to drop out. It tends to grow in old field situations and places that haven't been woods that long. At least that's where it's more common. There's no mistaking sassafras leaves. You got the one lobe mitten, or no thumbs on this mitten. This mitten has 2 thumbs, and so does this one right here. But often the leaves have a thumb on one side or the other, but not both. So there's 3 forms of the leaf on this tree. I think they all have 2 thumbs. You can see right there. But it's not uncommon to find one of the thumbs missing on what looks like a mitten. And there's another sassafras right above us here, being backlit by the sun. Right up there. And we've got a little sassafras sapling here to really illustrate what I was showing earlier. Some sassafras leaves are like a mitten with no thumbs. Some have the thumb on the left. Some have the thumb on the right. And often they have a thumb on each side. And most of this recording is going to be done on the Blue Loop Trail that goes through the center of this preserve. There is no parking at this preserve. There's some roadside parking near it, but not a lot. And plenty of places you can tie up your canoe. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to stop here today, because it's easy to get to in the canoe. Boy, we saw some gray birch overhanging the river. We couldn't really see the bark from where we were. We had to kind of look at the leaves as we were floating by. Well, here's some black birch with a leaf that is not arrowhead shaped, but more almost heart shaped at the bottom. The widest point is closer to the middle than the bottom of the leaf. But these get lichens on them that make them look actually the same color as gray birch. So they're easy to confuse when there's this much lichen growing on this tree. Instead of having the bronzish brown bark that it should have, it often looks like a gray birch. And without leaves, it'd be a little tricky. And I think we've got another species of oak right here, black oak. I don't often find black oak growing on ledges on some of the other hikes I do, but I'm finding it here. I was here in August and was amazed at some of the black oak and the size of the leaves on these black oaks. Especially if they're growing aggressively and have full sun. That leaf there, I'll put my hand in here for scale, is 2 hands long. And has similar geometry to that of northern red oak. The buds are much larger than that of a northern red oak. They're the largest buds of the trees we've seen so far today as far as oak trees go. For winter identification. There's your bud right there, probably at least a 1/2 inch long. And the acorns kind of look like the scarlet oak acorns. These ones are fortunately still stuck to the tree, so I can match the tree with the acorn and not have to figure that out. They're pretty similar to scarlet oak acorns as far as the size goes. They're not quite as pointy as a scarlet oak acorn. They're not quite the shape of that Hershey's Kiss. And the cap on these black oak acorns does not shine like that of the scarlet oak, and often starts to flake loose. You can see right there. So I've got all the acorns that we found so far today of the oaks that had acorns available for us to study, and there's several that we didn't find acorns of. But let's take a look. There's our northern red, probably the largest we found today. A white with that more coarsely knit cap. The scarlet with that shiny shellacked cap that's coarsely knit. And the Hershey's Kiss shaped nut inside it. And then our black oak, which has a nut that's kind of similar to the scarlet oak, but it's not quite as pointy, and the cap doesn't shine, and it tends to flake loose. We've got a few more minutes to explore this park. We're going to loop around on the Blue Trail, see if we can catch a few more trees to identify, and then head back on the water. And the golds of some of the maples down in this valley here are quite striking. And this park is mostly oak. A little bit of black birch, a lot of oak, and an occasional hickory for us to study. We found that mocker nut a couple hours ago, and I said that the bark tends to be always packed together. It's never flaking loose. Well, this pig nut hickory has some bark that is starting to break loose in places. Not a lot. It can get more extreme than that, but it's definitely not as tightly woven as the mocker nut. The nuts are much different. They're teardrop shaped with a real thin shell. And there's your mocker nut shell on the left. Pig nut has a teardrop shape. I'm not going to break it open, but that shell, or the husk around the nut, is almost paper thin. And It normally has 5 leaflets on each compound leaf, which I can see clearly as I look up the tree, but it's a little bit out of view for this camera. But if you look closely, right in the middle of the screen there, we do have an example of that. And after about a 1.5 mile hike on that blue, mostly blue trail with a little bit of orange, red, and yellow, the map of that Riverwood Preserve, you can download it right on your phone to overlap Google Maps, and that's what I did. That way I knew as I was paddling down the river if I was getting close to where their trails intersect the river. Because there are a few little signs along here, but you could easily miss them. So we're back on the water. It's about 2:30, quarter to 3. I might record just a little bit more on the way back to Potter Hill Dam and wrap this up, but we're going to be mostly paddling and looking at the scenery. And if something new comes along, we'll certainly take a few minutes to look at it. And an hour after getting on the river at the Riverwood Preserve, we've come to the takeout at the Potter Hill Dam. The takeout's on the left. There's more information on this stretch of river and this entire river put out by the Wood River Pawcatuck Association. They have maps and hazards like dams that are not safe to go over, obviously, and broken dams that you can run and all that. So that information is available. The trail map and information on Riverwood Preserve is put out by Westerly Rhode Island Land Trust. But here's one last beautiful red maple, which is more of a gold, at least on this part of the tree, for us to look at before we get out and make the shuttle back to get the car. So we'll keep doing these seasonal tree ID adventures. I'll try to do one this winter, maybe on snowshoes, maybe on skis, maybe on foot. And I'm always looking for scenic and interesting places to do these adventures, and try to find some trees that haven't been looked at as much on these adventures as well. So I think we got well over a dozen today, trees, including, I think it was 7 species of oak. So to get 7 species of oak on one hike or one adventure, not easy to do in some parts of the country, but it's not hard to do around here. So we'll continue on with these in 2024.